Okay. So our next class of disorders are schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Now, once again, you're hearing the word spectrum because the DSM-5 has tried to not just categorize distinct disorders, but if there are conditions on a spectrum, they get put into a broader phraseology. So schizophrenia spectrum disorders includes things like traditional schizophrenia, brief psychotic disorders, delusional disorders, paranoid personality disorders, and so forth. But let's talk about schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a form of a psychotic disorder. It involves having disorganized thought, delusional thought, sensory or perceptual disturbances, some level of emotional display problems, whether it be blunted affect or inappropriate affect, and then sometimes bizarre behaviors. So in some cases, schizophrenia shows up with catatonia. So a person who's catatonic, they have some form of a motor-based problem. So in some cases, the person can have motor rigidity, where they're immobile. In other cases, they can have excessive or wild motor activity. So, and then we see more stereotyped or ritualistic behaviors as well. This is catatonia. Now, catatonia, while it shows up in schizophrenia, it also shows up in other conditions. For example, in severe cases of depression, a person can become catatonic. I was working with an individual who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and older adult in a senior care facility. I was doing therapy with him, and when he was functioning optimally, we could have talk therapy and things were great. When he decompensated and went into a severe depression, he did become catatonic to the point where he could not speak. He drooled on himself, so he couldn't control even his mouth functioning. And that was linked to like that severe depression to the point where he became immobilized in many ways. So catatonia isn't just a symptom of schizophrenia. Okay. We also have paranoia. So paranoia is heightened suspiciousness, can be connected with delusions, things like delusions of persecution, feeling like people are out to get you or plotting against you. So there's a sense of mistrust for people. There's a interpretation that people are more hostile to you. Neutral or benign things will be interpreted with greater offense. We have aloofness or distance. We have the feeling that people are plotting against one or persecuting them or targeting them or holding them back. Now, there is a personality disorder called paranoid personality disorder. What's the difference between having paranoid schizophrenia or schizophrenia with paranoia, better yet, than paranoid personality disorder? The answer is simple. You have that suspiciousness, you have those persecutory beliefs, but you don't have the hallucinations. You don't have the other features, right? So it's more target at just suspiciousness. Okay, but in schizophrenia, you could have catatonia, you could have paranoia, you can have disorganization, right? So people with schizophrenia struggle when it comes to speech and behavior. So you might have bizarre speech, something called loosening of associations. And loosening of associations is where a person starts talking about something and then skips as if part of the story is missing and jumps. And we're not talking about a person going on a tangent. It's just from sentence to sentence, it doesn't make sense, right? So I'll I'll show you an example of loosening of associations or derailment. I woke up this morning. Ice cream is really good. I'm rooting for the 49ers. I hope you're well. So those are four sentences that really are disjointed. They're not connected. Now, maybe in my mind, if I had this loosening of association, I made the connection, but it's not apparent to you. It's kind of like choppy. We also have word salad, where a person starts to put words together in a sentence that the sentence no longer makes sense. We also have something called neologisms as it relates to speech, where a person makes up new words. We're not talking about slang because that is a widespread embrace set of words. We're talking about words only you understand what they mean. So uh, then we have cases of schizophrenia where it's hard to say, it's undifferentiated. So their varied symptoms doesn't fit into one set of categories. And then we have people who receive treatment who have gotten a little bit better. The positive symptoms of schizophrenia are gone. So they no longer have hallucinations and delusions, but they have some residual effects. Now, very important, when I say positive symptoms of schizophrenia, I am not saying that these positive symptoms are good. What I'm saying, these are thoughts, emotions, and behavior that are added to your reality, right? Added to your experience. Whereas negative symptoms are aspects of normal thoughts, emotion, behaviors that are missing. So things like hallucinations and delusions, which are more of the psychotic dimension, those are positive symptoms because you're hearing things that aren't there. You're seeing things that aren't there. You're believing things that aren't real. So these are things added to your reality versus negative symptoms where things are kind of removed. So let's talk about delusions. Delusions are false beliefs that are absent of reality, and despite evidence to the contrary, people stick to. And I'm not talking about you got into an argument with your friend and you still believe you're right. We're talking about basic things that are clear cut. So where you can prove that it's not true, but the person still sticks to their belief. So a delusion of reference, that is a feeling that there are hidden messages out there specifically for you, or messages they're talking specifically about you. So if you read a newspaper and there is some editorial, you might personalize it and feel that that person is giving you a special message. Or you might think there's a secret code in magazine. These are what we call delusions of reference. If you look at the movie A Beautiful Mind, you will see some of these examples. Delusions of grandeur are a false belief that you're some major historical figure, such as feeling that you're Napoleon, and not that you have features like Napoleon, but you are actually Napoleon. Now, you can't be Napoleon because Napoleon is dead and has been dead for over or about 200 years or so, right? So you can't be Napoleon. But if you, no matter what, I show you your birth certificate, I show you a DNA test, and you still believe you're Napoleon, that is what we call a delusion of grandeur. Some people feel that they are the second coming of Jesus, or actually Jesus, right? So that would be a good example of a delusion of grandeur. So these kind of examples where a person devoid of evidence is claiming they're someone they're not, or some major historical figure, would be a delusion of grandeur. Delusion of persecution, this is similar or linked to paranoia, right? So the person feels that they're intentionally being targeted, plotted against, discriminated against, interfered with, despite evidence to the contrary. Now, if people are actually targeting you or plotting against you, that's one thing. But to feel people are targeting against you and there's no evidence, that would be more of a delusion of persecution. And delusion of jealousy is another one of these things where a person might feel that their partner is cheating on them or going to cheat on them. And this happens from time to time where I've had a person go through a person's email, their text message, their social media, everything, feel that their partner's cheating on them, hire a PI. And then in the end, the partner was never cheating on them, but they just felt it and they still believed it. That's called a delusion of jealousy. Now, a delusion in of itself isn't enough to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. You need multiple features, remember. So if a person is more suspicious or jealous, right, that's not enough to diagnose with schizophrenia. Hallucinations. Now, hallucinations are sensory or perceptual disturbances. We have auditory hallucinations where you're hearing things that aren't there. Now, hearing things can be a sound, it could be hearing voices, it could be a single voice, it could be multiple voices. That voice can be supportive and cheering you on, that voice can be critical. That voice could be telling you to do something, and that is the most dangerous, right? So if we have auditory command hallucinations, that is what we worry about, because if you hear a voice that says push someone in front of a train, which has happened in New York City, right, there are several laws that were created to protect the general public based on people hearing voices, thinking that that's what they were told to do. So that would be something you have to screen. So if a person says they're hearing things, you want to know, is it a sound? Is it a voice? Is it multiple voices? Are they telling you to do anything? So you ask a whole host of questions. Now, visual hallucinations are seeing things that aren't present. You could see colors that aren't there. You could see people that aren't there, right? It could be any number of things. These are our two most common hallucinations, followed by the other senses of gustatory, olfactory, and tactile, taste-based, smell-based, or touch. Now, the most common of all five are actually auditory hallucinations. Disorganized thought. So we talked a little bit about this, but the person has some kind of loose associations. They can't follow a train of thought. They're super tangential. They can have word salad where, their sentences no longer have structure or meaning. They invent new words, as I mentioned, and so forth. Now, affect has to do with emotions. Mood is how you're feeling on the inside. Affect is the expression of emotion on the outside. So we do ask people how they're feeling because we want to know how they're feeling on the inside. But we can infer how a person's feeling by the way they look. When it comes to schizophrenia and other conditions, we have something called affective disturbances. So there's this inappropriate or disturbance in how one expresses emotions. So if there's a blunting affect, a blunting of affect or a blunted affect, now we see the person is showing the correct emotion, but it's more subdued. So they have a subdued expression of emotion. Then we have flat affect. That is where the person doesn't show any emotion whatsoever, right? So it's almost like a screensaver. And then we have inappropriate affect where the person's expression of emotion doesn't match the context. So laughing hysterically when describing the death of a parent or going to a funeral, unless you absolutely hated your parent, That is an atypical reaction. Most people, when they hear of the death of a loved one or they describe the death of a loved one, they usually are crying. They usually are sad. So laughter is not what we would expect in that case. So that's considered inappropriate. Now, if we were to look at, like, from a developmental point of view, there are different stages of schizophrenia. And it's important to understand that most cases of schizophrenia are diagnosed in our late adolescence or early adulthood. That's when we typically diagnose schizophrenia. And you'll see why in a minute. So in childhood, we refer to this as premorbid. So this is before the diagnosis. The person shows maybe some minor social issues or cognitive impairment. They might struggle in the classroom a little bit, but struggling in the classroom is not the same as having schizophrenia, right? There's no psychotic break. Then we have what's called the prodromal phase. This is during puberty or early teenage years. The person can become a little bit more moody or angry or withdrawn or obsessive. Again, you might say, well, that's typical teenagers for you, right? So sometimes they're a little bit more moody or withdrawn. So it's only in the late teens or early adulthood where you have your first psychotic episode, typically. Can you have childhood schizophrenia? The answer is yes. But typically, your first psychotic break is in your late teens, early 20s, when the pressures of life start to show up and you no longer can compensate for those pressures. So the late teens we refer to as the progressive stage. That's when the diagnosis of schizophrenia happens. Now, a person who has schizophrenia is not in a psychotic state from that point forward. They do have periods of lucidity or clarity, or what we would call quote unquote normal. And they go back and forth between psychotic states and normal states, right? So we have what's called a relaxing and remitting kind of cycle, psychosis to normal, psychosis to normal. We see in your late teens, early 20s, there are strong positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So those hallucinations and delusions are there. With age, positive symptoms of schizophrenia kind of slow down a bit. And you start to have fewer episodes of the hallucinations and delusions, but you still have schizophrenia, right? You still have some of the residual effects or those negative symptoms of schizophrenia, the inability to socialize, being overly withdrawn, the inability to take care of one's basic hygiene, things like that. So there are the negative symptoms that are still there. But notice, we can only detect it well in late teens, early 20s, because that's when the first psychotic break happens typically. And I also want you to note that even when a person has psychosis, you know, with proper medication, with therapy, they can go out of that psychotic state and have extended periods of quote unquote normal life experience. So taking medication in this case would be a really good thing because a person does not have to be in a psychotic state. Okay. So how do we explain schizophrenia? From a biological point of view, we explain it based on dopamine. And when we talked about neuroscience earlier in the semester, we said that high levels of dopamine is linked to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, right? So the hallucinations, the delusions, the agitation, it's because you have an excess amount of dopamine or you have a hypersensitivity to dopamine, right? But either way, from a biological point of view, dopamine is linked. From a psychological point of view, there's something called a double bind hypothesis, which means basically a child is receiving mixed messages or contradictory messages which are incompatible, right? And they have a hard time reconciling this incompatibility, and it results in disorganization, inability to discern which perceptions are reliable or unreliable, and whatnot. Now, the double blind hypothesis is an early hypothesis. In the early 1900s, it was pretty popular. Today, through research, we really haven't found too much support for it. But because it was a common, pervasive explanation, I wanted you to know it. Okay, so let me separate out schizophrenia from our mood disorders.